No, what? They're not done. If we waited for them to get done talking, we might be waiting a while. Oh, I guess it is about that time. Thanks to John for stepping in last week while I was in Lexington. Prayer list. Anybody new? Any updates? Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Venable? Okay. The Pembroke teacher, young teacher down there. Yeah. Anybody else? I know there is a bunch of respiratory stuff going on right now with a bunch of people I know. Hit me while I was in Lexington last week, and it took me over half the week this week to get through it, it felt like. Anybody else? People in Mississippi, little town of Rolling Fork, Mississippi, and after what we went through a year and a half ago, I think we have a better appreciation for it, but that little town is almost gone from what I've seen in the pictures. And I think there were over 20 who died in Mississippi Friday night. 26 now? Okay. And a lot of those pictures look a lot like the pictures we saw from Mayfield and Dawson Springs and Princeton a couple of years ago. Anything else? Mike, could I get you to start us? All right, thank you, sir. All right, we are wrapping up Lessons from the Kings today. What we're going to do next week, I'll leave till the end of this, and we'll have a little pop-up on that. But if you want to go ahead and turn your Bible or your digital Bible to 2 Kings 20. 2 Kings 20, I'll be looking for you guys to help me out there and read a little bit as we go through. But we're looking and wrapping up our lessons from the Kings, and today will be the life and times of King Hezekiah, part 2. A couple of weeks ago, we spent some time looking at Hezekiah. There again is an artist's rendering of a coin depicting Hezekiah. We're going to look sort of at three significant times in Hezekiah's life. Actually, we're going to look at one main part. We're going to look back at a couple, but there are sort of three significant times in Hezekiah's life. One is what we covered 2 weeks ago. We covered Hezekiah's reformation. When Hezekiah became king at 25, he began one of the most ambitious religious and social reform programs in Jewish history. Because of these, the nation prospered economically and spiritually. We talked about it a couple of weeks ago. He came in and took out all the idols, tore down the high places, cut down the Asherah poles, got them back on track. So there was one significant part of his life. Then there was the siege by Assyria. We didn't spend any time on this, but this was a time that was an important time in Hezekiah's reign too. It was when the country was under siege by Assyria. Hezekiah refused to surrender, and instead he put his trust in God to save the nation, and God did save them, sending an angel to destroy 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. What saved him was that he sought the will of God in what to do in the matter, and then obeyed God in that matter. The quote I found from one writer commenting on this was, "Success is not based solely on the plan we choose to execute. For the believer, success comes when we seek and follow God's plan." Think that. Success comes when we seek and then we follow God's plan. Now, too often, we make God our last resort. We see the example of Hezekiah, that Hezekiah did not make God his last resort, he made him his first resort. But too often we make God our last resort. So the question comes up, why? Why do we make God our last resort? Any answers? Any thoughts? Why do we make God our last option instead of our first? Lack of faith? What are some other reasons? Some I just jotted down, some of the reasons we may elect to make God our last resort instead of our first. One, we think we can handle it. We think, we can handle this, we can take care of it, and we try to do it ourselves first. Another thing, we think it is too small for God. How many of you ever had an issue come up and you go, I really don't want to bother the Lord with this because that's just not big. Compared to things that other people are going through, this is little stuff. Sadly, what happens many times there is something we think is start out as something little, ends up becoming what? Something big. And where we might have been able to had it, take care of it, or gotten it already taken care of if we'd have turned to God in the first place with it. But I think a lot of times we think that some of the things that come up in our lives are too small to hand off to God. We are ashamed of the situation. Sometimes maybe we're embarrassed, or maybe we're ashamed to even ask God to get us out of something that we got ourselves into. How many of you with your real parents, your earthly parents, got yourself into a situation you were afraid to ask them to help you with because you were ashamed of what maybe you'd done? And I think sometimes we get afraid to turn and ask God because we're a little embarrassed with where we find ourselves. Maybe it's because we believe needing help is weakness. What's the world today tell us when you reach out and you have to have somebody to help you do something? It sort of teaches you and tells you that you're weak, that you're failing, that you ought to be able to take care of this. When actually, when you recognize that you need help, what is that actually? Is that weakness or strength when you come to the realization you need help? I heard somebody say it. It's a strength. At the point you realize that you can't do it yourself, that's a strength. It's not weakness. And sometimes our faith is weak. Sometimes our faith is weak and we don't turn it over to God until our backs are against the wall. And sometimes it may be because we feel unworthy. I think one of Satan's great tools is to stand right behind us when we find ourselves in situations that are difficult for us, that he's sitting there tapping us on the shoulder going, see, you shouldn't have done this. God's not going to want to hear from you. He's not going to want to help you because you're not worth helping out because of what you've done. But the exact opposite is there. It's true. We're never too unworthy for God to help us out. Writer wrote, we are inclined to stray. We have a propensity to turn away from Him. In other words, when times are good, when everything is going just fine, it's only natural that we tend to think we don't need Him. The only way we can have the deepest possible relationship with Him is if we are turning to Him all the time in the good times and in the bad times. Do you think what God wants us to go to Him when we've gotten that new job and the promotion at work and things are going good and it's right? Do you think He wants to celebrate with us on that? I think He does. I think He wants to hear from us when things are good. That was my phone, by the way. But I think He wants to hear from us in the good times, not just the bad. And I think a relationship with God is deeper when we're communicating and reaching out to Him in good and bad and early in situations that come along in our lives, not waiting until we've got our backs against the wall and we need help badly. Now, the third significant incident we're going to spend a little time on today is Hezekiah's illness. And here's where we're going to be spending some time in 2 Kings 20. But we're going to look at Hezekiah's illness here. If someone will read verse 1 of chapter 20. Hezekiah depicted in his bed. Isaiah comes and tells him basically what? Isaiah's Mr. Cheerful here, isn't he? Isaiah tells him, this is not going to go well. Isaiah comes and tells him, you're going to die. And that you're not going to recover. Someone will read verses 2 and 3. All right, thank you, Mike. I was just going to turn this on silent mode so that does not keep making noise. All right, so we see in this that Hezekiah, as he's done throughout his reign as king, gives a familiar response, and what's he immediately do when he's told he's not going to make it? What was that? I heard. Praise turns to God. He immediately turns to God after being told he's not going to make it. He also tells God he believes that he doesn't deserve this and that he's been good and done his best. Sounds like he's doing a little negotiating with God here, doesn't it? It's like, God, I know I'm sick, I know I'm dying, but you know, I came in, I did your will, I did the things you wanted me to do. And, what about a little more time? If someone now will read beginning of verse 4 and read through verse 7. Yeah. All right. All right. So, the Lord speaks to Isaiah and gives him a message here for Hezekiah. And Isaiah had actually not gotten very far down the road, had he? He had delivered the message to Hezekiah that this was not going well. Hezekiah immediately turns to God, and before Isaiah can get out the courtyard, God says, hold up. God says, I have heard his request. God has been moved by Hezekiah's grief and tears. Note, not by his argument, but by his grief and tears. Let's talk a little compassion and logic here. Logically, Hezekiah, good guy, but he's still a sinful man, and logically, it's probably time for him to die. Compassion, God has compassion here on Hezekiah and his request. You look up the compassion, definition of compassion in Webster's. Compassion is sympathetic consciousness of others' distress together with a desire to alleviate it. Logic is a particular mode of reasoning viewed as valid or faulty. That's sort of cold and sort of just straightforward, as opposed to compassion. Something that forces a decision apart from or in opposition to reason. My question here as we look at Hezekiah's situation and our situation with God, do we want logic or compassion from the Father? Compassion. Because if we look at logic, what does logic tell you? That a man that's created by an all-powerful, all-righteous being, man who deliberately betrays his will and goes against it, what does logic tell you should happen? That man should be cast aside. That God should not have anything further to do with a creation that has so blatantly turned its back on him over and over and over through time. But yet the compassion of God, the compassion of the Father is that he cares and he loves us and he's willing to do. God was motivated in this instance by Hezekiah's grief and distress. One of the powerful messages of this situation to me tells us that God hears and listens, and he has compassion on us in our times of trial and distress and grief and pain and agony. And that we should always pray. We may not get the exact answer we want, but we see from this example that he hears our prayers and he'll respond in some fashion. We don't want logic, we need compassion. God promises Hezekiah, coming out of this situation, he promises him he'll be well enough to go to the temple in 3 days. He will add 15 years to his life. He will save the city from the Assyrians. and he will continue to protect Jerusalem. All good things that come out of this. Now, Hezekiah may have some issues because he begins to feel maybe a little overconfident after this. And maybe it's his overconfidence that ultimately leads to the fall to the Babylonians. But at this point, God has answered Hezekiah's prayer and given him more time and healed him. I do find it interesting that the way they heal this instance. Jeremy, have you ever told anybody to put a fig cake on their hip? A fig cake. A fig cake. All right, if someone will read verses 8 through 11. Thank you. Just after Mike reads that, and as I listen to that again, do you ever think God sat there and goes, wait a minute, maybe I'm going to change my mind? God has said through Isaiah he's going to heal him. And Hezekiah says what? Yeah, prove it to me. It's not enough that God says he's going to heal. Prove it to me. And so we have the instance of the shadow going backwards. But it's just an interesting moment, I think, to me, that you wonder if God's sitting there going, well, maybe I shouldn't have given him that 15 years. Hezekiah wants proof, and he wants a sign right away. Sounds a lot like us today still, doesn't it? We want God to answer what we are asking for. We want him to answer right now, and we want him to answer it in the way we want it answered. Then, all right, someone reads verses 12 through 15. All right. Through 15. Thank you. What kind of impression do you get from Hezekiah here? The Babylonians come. It's like, I get the feel he's like a child showing off all the things he's got, cool things he's got in his room. If you had a child and they would have another child come visit and they look at this, I've got this in my closet and I have this in here, this here. This is what this feels like to me with Hezekiah. The Babylonians come in and go, see, we've got this, we've got this, we've got this, we've got this. Little pride here from Hezekiah. Pride opens the door. He shows this emissary from the Babylonians just everything he's got. And if the Babylonians weren't thinking about an invasion prior to this point, you can see them going back and going, look at all this stuff. We invade them. We can take this. We can have all of this. Hezekiah had prospered with his reforms. He was showing off the wealth of his nation in an attempt to build political friendships with the Babylonians. You know, we talked about a couple of weeks ago, not relying on God, but relying on relationships with these heathen countries for stability and safety. So now here we see Hezekiah trying to build a relationship with the Babylonians. He's worried about the Assyrians at this point, but who ultimately invades the country? It would be the Babylonians. He quickly forgot that he had no need for political alliances with pagan nations and did not realize he was setting himself up for a future attack. He may have been a little overconfident because remember, God had promised him, 15 more years of life, and he would protect the city. Contingent on trust and obedience. And we'll look at it here a little bit more further in a second, but Hezekiah becomes a little short-sighted here. He becomes looking at the here and now and what's good for him and not what's good for the long-term security of his people. If someone will pick up at verse 16 and read through 19. All right, thank you, Marshall. See our little problem here with Hezekiah? Isaiah's telling him that the Babylonians are going to come through and take everything. But as Marcia read there, at the very end, Hezekiah says what? Basically, what Hezekiah says here is, well, good, at least it's not going to happen while I'm king. He's worried about his legacy. He's worried about his immediate future. He knows that God's guaranteed him 15 more years of life, and he'll protect the city while he's there. Hezekiah's just saying, woohoo, they're going to like me because it's not going to happen while I'm here. Never minding that the Babylonians will come in and take everything. Just, hey, not going to happen while I'm here. Isaiah predicts the utter destruction of the city. He predicts the exile of its people. He even predicts the eventual influence of Daniel and 3 young nobles from Jerusalem who were Hezekiah's royal descendants. Author wrote, Hezekiah has a rather short-term view of what Isaiah has said. He believes and accepts it, but since it is in the future, he's relieved, even happy that he can look forward to 15 years of peace and prosperity. Little short-sighted here. Worried about how it's going to look on him. He probably thought that Babylon's becoming a great power was good since he wouldn't have to worry about Assyria. But it becomes Babylon that comes in. All right, some lessons we learn going through this story about Hezekiah and his illness. Learn to maintain a humble spirit. It's when pride sneaks into Hezekiah here that a problem comes along, but we should learn to maintain a humble spirit. Yeah. Now, as Tim read from Proverbs, pride goeth before the fall. And that's where we see Hezekiah. And I think one of the things we learn out of Hezekiah is this is a man who had done great things in terms of what God wanted. He had come in, he had got the country spiritually back on track. But I think this tells us that pride can impact any of us at any point. It can sneak into our lives and cause us problems. So we should learn to maintain a humble spirit. Sometimes that's not always easy, but we should learn to try and maintain a humble spirit. We should learn not to be short-sighted. Hezekiah became short-sighted here. He was worried about the immediate future and how that would reflect on him, rather than what was going to happen down the road for the people. Sometimes we as Christians today get caught up in the same thing. We're worried about today, tomorrow, next week, and not how some things may impact us or our families or our friends and loved ones years and years down the road. Sometimes we try to just get through it today and not worry about the impact that just getting through it today will have on tomorrow. But we need to learn not to be short-sighted. Hezekiah's short-sightedness, worrying about only the Assyrians now, not what the Babylonians may have been trying to learn and pick up from him, ends up leading to the fall and the exile. God's person is very human. Or we should say, as God's people, we are still very human. Writer wrote that looking at what Hezekiah did does not reveal him to be some kind of superhero. It shows someone with a spotty record with some great, some good, some bad, and some stupid moments. Which probably would describe most all of us. Even the best and the brightest and what we would term the greatest of God's people all fall into these categories at one point or the other. Being God's person doesn't mean being perfect. It means that we remain God's person despite our successes and failures. What we need to learn is that when we fail, do not listen to Satan tell us that means you're not God's person. But when we have our successes, that's where we need to get back to maintaining that humble spirit. Being a God's person does not mean we're perfect. It means we remain His person in the good times and in the bad times. God's person relies on God. Hezekiah usually had an automatic reaction whenever something bad happened. He went straight to the temple to pray about it. He went to God. His first response was prayer and seeking God's will. And the times he failed, we see it was because he failed to do this. How many of you, if you look back over the course of your life, situations you found yourself in, would find that the times you went to God first went a whole lot smoother than the times you waited and went to God last? Or maybe went significantly smoother than the times you didn't turn it over to God at all. God should be our first response, not our last response. Not our second response, not our third response, not our fourth, not the last, but our response should be to go to God first. God's person lives by grace. Despite his mistakes, even compound mistakes, God blessed Hezekiah. Or God's blessings on Hezekiah because of what he had done to earn it or merit it. Bring that forward. Are any of the blessings that we get and receive from God today because we have earned them? No. The blessings we get from God today are because of what? His mercy, His compassion, and His grace. Despite our mistakes, despite Hezekiah's mistakes, God blessed Hezekiah. Hezekiah lost as many as he won, but God blessed him anyway. It made no sense. It didn't add up. The blessings compared to the track record. Grace doesn't add up. Think that. Grace doesn't add up. It isn't logical, and it's not based on scores or what you deserve. Grace is getting what you don't deserve. God's not keeping a scorecard. Grace is not His keeping a scorecard. Grace is us receiving unmerited blessings from Him because of His love and, as Tim said, His compassion for us. What would we get if we got what we really deserve? Death. Grace is getting what you don't deserve. And I think sometimes as Christians, we sort of try to understand that and keep it in the back of our minds, but sometimes we think we have to do so many good things. We have to go to church so many times a year. We have to do so many activities a month that's what we have to do to earn the grace. The thing is, we can't earn the grace. The things we do and the activities and the things we do for the Father and for Jesus are because we love them. We're not doing it to merit anything because we can't do enough to merit His grace. Grace is when we get what we don't deserve. The only reason we will ever survive our past mistakes, present weaknesses, and future failures is because as God's people in Jesus Christ, God has decided to extend His grace toward us. Did He have to do that? Were we as mankind good enough that God just said, I got to give them my grace because they're trying real hard? God, out of His love and His compassion, extends His grace to us. There are some specific prayer lessons I think we get from Hezekiah here. Hezekiah's prayer was immediate. It wasn't an afterthought. It was prior to making his plans. We are so geared to react in life that it is hard for us to go first to God. That was especially poignant to me because we're geared that we just jump in right away and try to fix it. And then after we don't get it fixed ourselves, we say, oops, we forgot to ask God for help. God was not an afterthought here with Hezekiah. It was his first thought. Hezekiah's prayer was open and honest. Hezekiah was transparent before the Lord. Now, get you a deep theological question here. Why should we be transparent, open, and honest in our prayer if we have an all-knowing Father? Doesn't He already know what we're going to be talking about? Why is it important for us to be open and honest? Humble. To ask and to recognize that we have come short and we have failed and that we need help. You know, I think sometimes we think that we may have to go to God and tell Him some things that He may have never heard before. You look down through the thousands of years of history of mankind, there's nothing that God hadn't seen or heard that man can do. There's nothing that you can ask Him about or ask forgiveness for that God hasn't already seen. I think we forget that. And it gets back to that point I had earlier about being embarrassed and ashamed of the situation we find ourselves in. Man's not that intelligent and creative to do something new. We've just found new ways to do it. But all the evils and things that man you see doing and going on in places now have been going on for thousands of years. We've just changed the way in which we do it. But we need to be open and honest when we go to the Father. Hezekiah's prayer was bold. Hezekiah, one author wrote, had the kind of relationship with God where it wasn't a surprise when Hezekiah showed up to pray. There are some of us, I'm sure, sad to say, probably even me at times too. You know, God's nudging somebody in heaven and say, look who's praying. Our prayer life with the Father should be such that it's not a surprise when we're on our knees in prayer, or when we're reaching out with questions, or when we're looking for answers for difficulties in life. I think, but a lot of us, sometimes we're afraid to ask God. We feel like we're bothering God. But it shouldn't be a surprise when we show up in prayer. Hezekiah had a faith in God that allowed him to pray with confidence. You need to understand that faith is always based on the promises of God. Some things God has promised to do, some He hasn't. God has promised to always get glory for Himself and always work things for an ultimate good. When we go to Him in prayer, we need to understand the answer may not be the answer we expect it to be, but that the answer will be for an ultimate good. Hezekiah knew God had promised to save his people. He knew God had placed him in the position of authority over them. He had confidence that God would do what He had promised to do. Hezekiah trusted God to be faithful to His word, so he was willing to act in faith. Hezekiah had complete trust in God that God would do what He said He would do, and that He would do it for the benefit of what was right. So, lots of lessons we can learn from Hezekiah and his illness. A lot of them were good, but there were a couple that where he failed. But I think ultimately what we learn from Hezekiah and his illness is, one, the going to God in prayer. Going to God should be our first response. I think we also see the example that God hears our request. He will respond. It may not be what we think it ought to be, but He will respond for what is right. We should never be afraid. We should never be ashamed. We should never hesitate to go to God first. That's what He wants us to do. He wants us to go to Him. He wants us to rely on Him. And then we learn that His grace, there's nothing we can do, but yet if we'll go to Him, His love continues to flow towards us. So, we've gone through some lessons from David. We've gone through a lesson from Hanan. We've gone through lessons from Hezekiah and Saul. Hopefully, there are some things we picked up through that. Next week, we will start a new little series. That series will be, we'll look at grace in the book of Romans. Speaking of grace, we're going to look at grace and we're going to study grace out from the book of Romans. So we'll be spending several weeks in Romans and getting in depth a little bit on some matters of grace. And by the clock, we are out of time.